Over to you.
Hello, everyone. I would like to welcome everyone to our Dorothy Heathcote Archive panel. And I will start with a short introduction of our three panelists. We have Dr. Sandra Hesten, Professor Tony Jackson, and Dr. David Allen with us. And I'll start with Sandra. From 1972 till 1973, Sandra attended Dorothy Heathcote's Dip and Drama full-time course at Newcastle University. From 1982 to 1983, she attended a full-time MA Theatre Studies at Lancaster University, where her dissertation, Some Prismatic Perspectives on DH and Her Work, provided the seed for the later work. From 1983 to 1993, she created the Dorothy Heathcote Archive. It was launched at a special conference in 1993. In 1994, she completed a PhD on Dorothy and the keyword index for the archive. The former is a manual, a guide to Dorothy's methodology, whilst the latter provides the user with a pathway through the labyrinth of material. Currently, she is officially retired, but she says not from Dorothy. For example, her concepts of school is everywhere, and particularly during lockdown, the drama of the mind. Tony Jackson is Emeritus Professor of Educational Theatre at University of Manchester. Books which he's edited and authored include Learning Through Theatre, Theatre Education and the Making of Meanings, and Performing Heritage. He pioneered the teaching of participatory theatre in education and higher education, co-founded Manchester Centre for Applied Theatre Research, has been an active board member of several professional young people's theatre companies in the Northwest, and has guest lectured in Europe, the USA, South Africa, and Australia. David Allen is Artistic Director of Midland Actors Theatre. The company stages professional theatre productions as well as undertaking community and education projects. MAT is lead partner on 2 Erasmus Plus projects looking at rolling role and the commission model. It was a lead partner on a previous Erasmus Plus project on Mantle of the Expert. David is administrator for the www.mantlenetwork.com website, which features Dorothy's work, and also for the Facebook group, The Commission Model of Teaching. He knew Dorothy and consulted with her on several of the company's projects for schools. So I'm delighted to have you all here, and we also have with us Dr. Tomasz Fisiak, who will be supervising the chat and then leading the Q&A session. So please put all your questions into the chat window. And I will start with the first question, a question to Sandra. And I would like to start with a short reflection that came to me as we actually as a result of conversations that we had prior to this panel. It seems to me that Dorothy looked at the archive as a myriad of fragments, and the notion of a fragment was very important for Dorothy. It seems to me that she wanted the users of the archive to encounter a collection of fragments, and so they have to navigate their own way through that collection, rather than to encounter a kind of ready-made structure. So she understood, we may say, the importance of discovery and of search for meaning. And I wanted to ask you, could you tell us a little bit about your experience of working with Dorothy and creating the archive. Yes, so the beginnings really. Talk to us or tell us about the beginnings of the archive, the beginnings of this search for meaning, we might say.
Well, yes, and I'm so honored to be here at this Dorothy Now conference. Just so I don't meander too much from Agata's question, I hope you won't mind if I take the role of a talking document. Hashtag Dorothy, the Archive and me. My last tutorial of sorts with Dorothy 2011. On the day she died, by her bedside, holding her hand, I spoke of our dream, a digitized archive, her living book. Unable to speak, she squeezed my hand twice. I first met her 50 years ago, and some of the documents in the archive are even older and are badly in need of conservation, as am I. Initially, my perception of the archive was inspired by Peter Brook's formless hunch. Creating the archive was a learning journey, discovering other people's pieces of Dorothy. My job to assemble them loosely together, bit by bit, into a collective narrative akin to a collage. Each document a journey in waiting, with its own story and anecdote from Dorothy. She regarded the contents as projects in the making, with the added instruction that the document reads you. Dorothy was my constant guide, not forgetting husband Raymond, an inspiration to her and a mine of information to me. Archival seeds were sown when I attended her course and 10 years later embarked on a dissertation. Dorothy, 1973, Dorothy, 1983. She gave it the title, What Sticks Out? If Dorothy hadn't been on the cusp of retiring, I may never have created that archive. And by the way, what did stick out was the language used to describe her methodology. Words like frame, keying, internal coherence, minute particulars, all new and signposting a journey into the creation of a new language for drama in education. Next. In 1983, I followed the final weeks of her Dip Ed course. I interviewed everybody on it, including the first therapist, Jane Salis, who worked at the Portway Centre and later the Firebird Theatre. According to Raymond Berrier, a 1965 student, Dorothy's first course in 1963 had 6 students. She visited them in their schools prior, during, and post-diploma. Imagine that. Her 1984 to 6 2-year part-time MEd for local teachers complemented the circle. The concept of rolling roll was first introduced by secondary schools in 3 linked dissertations: Norman Buick, Ida Cochran, and Malcolm Davison, 1986. After interviewing many students on that final course or observing their tutorials, I realized what a hugely significant moment it was. What sticks out became an important archival mantra in getting to the heart of her methodology. Dorothy used metaphors to reveal its inner layers, from archaeological digs to the detective model. She often referred to Marlene Trushinska's 1978 dissertation, where she compared drama strategies to ingredients being stirred into a recipe for a tasty apple pie. What sticks out about the archival journey? The continuing evolution of her methodology, rooting her concepts in past, present, or future lessons, often discussed in tutorials. That's why the audio tapes are so important, said Dorothy. What sticks out? 42 Great North Road. The material there formed the basis of the archive. I remember looking round, wondering what's going to happen to all this material when she retires and assembles it into boxes. Her living work, her working home, a place she shared with students from 1973 until 1986. I was one of the first students to share this home, albeit the final 2 weeks of the course, and surrounded by rubble. Next page. Keith Sturgis and Margaret Eddershaw from Lancaster University played a key role in the archive's creation. When I discussed with them the possibility of all this material being dumped on a skip, the idea of creating an archive emerged. They were instrumental in creating a home for it in the Department of Theatre Studies. Keith suggested that my PhD could be linked to the archive. The two went hand in hand on the journey. With some trepidation, I approached Dorothy about creating her archive. She responded with a steely glint in her eye, warning in forthright Yorkshire. And I don't do all those references so beloved of academics. And then she added with a mischievous smile, and I want it to be unedited, open-ended, freely available, not just another dry, dusty old archive. I sensed the journey might be challenging. The first task was to find a nearby temporary home at my friend Peter's house. The next to transport 45 boxes, approximately 2,500 documents comprising 30,000 pages, 650 hours of video, 2,000 hours of audio, and 3,500 still images, and all in my Mini. Up and down the A1, several journeys. Dog's body was a role Dorothy gave herself. I find myself using it frequently. Dorothy suggested hiring a church hall to sort it all out. But I discussed the idea with my husband. Working in computers, he suggested treat the computer like a huge dustbin. Keep the material where it is. Simply provide each document with a reference number. I hesitated, knowing nothing about computers. Still, when I realized that Dorothy's box order could be kept intact, I seized the opportunity with open arms. Family members were all given jobs. Configuring the database into fields was my husband's. Then I selected 7 fields: reference number, origin, date, form, title, originator, and key words. Dorothy had roughly sorted the documents. That was my starting point. Part of my journey was to select, analyze, and create a searchable keyword index from an ever-growing list of concepts. Role, role convention, role distance, ritual, myth, metaphor, time, productive tension, sequencing, sign, space, symbol, empowerment, and empathy. I then distilled the methodology using these concepts to unlock the database. Last page. Each concept was to have its very own journey. In my PhD in 1994, I piloted 3 model thesauri based on dissertations. Solis Holtz on symbol, 1979. Luke Abbott on role, 1982. Eileen Pennington on ritual, 1986. I used footnotes to cross-reference the archive, from which I extracted a key word, thesaurus. 3 flowcharts illustrated her methodology, which Dorothy later characterized as building blocks. Knowing that for Dorothy, the past was ever present, the historian John Fiennes provided valuable insights. She once said to him, "When you're planning a lesson, think of where the beginning should be. Then take 5 steps back." John Carroll's passion for linking technology and drama inspired my approach, not forgetting his Dr. Lister, 1980, providing one of the models for person in role. John wanted to press a button and get the lot at his desk in Australia. Perhaps now it would be on his mobile phone in the classroom. My research methodology was threefold. 1, Dorothy and her documents, traveling to Newcastle, back and forth, week by week, dot by dot, box by box, with her. She also said, "Follow me." And so I did for 10 years, home and abroad. For example, The Thin Screen, 1991, video of Dorothy working in industry, the only video. And she worked on the reinvention of mantle for managers, her off-guard concept. Secondly, those she inspired and those who inspired her, their first-hand experiences as related to me, and their documents. Thirdly, cross-references, a host of them, from educators, theatre practitioners, artists, poets, playwrights, philosophers, sociologists, and including people Dorothy called proper thinkers. The archive was to have 3 phases: documents 1, 2, videos and images, 3, audio. What sticks out? Well, I think I've run out of time. Anyway, thank you so much for listening, and I hope it made sense. And perhaps I might make a podcast of it. David, what do you think?
I think an excellent idea, Sandra. And I think now for Tony and I, it's going to be a case of follow that. How do we follow that? Agata, over to you.
Sandra, thank you. It was an exciting journey indeed, and thank you for bringing some of this excitement here and sharing it with us. My next question is to David. You have visited the archive recently, so can you tell us a little bit about your experience?
Yes, first of all, I want to apologize. I seem to be like I'm a ghost again. The light is, believe it or not, I'm sitting in a darkened room with the curtains closed, but you can barely see me because of something here. I'm in Kate Katafiosh's office. I don't know how to change the light with the camera, whatever. I'm just not technically competent. So please apologize. I'm looking like a ghost again. So first of all, yes, I went there recently to the archive, and I was just so excited. It's such an amazing treasure trove of untapped resources, and I knew you could spend months and months just looking at the contents of one of the boxes. So I did make a little short film while I was there, and Iris and team, if we could share it now, the film. Yes, you may have caught a glimpse there of Claire Armstrong Mills. She went up to the archive with me. And yes, that was our experience. 88 boxes of materials and more boxes of books. Agata.
Thank you, David. It's great to see some of the material from the archive. I was thinking about this issue, this problem, that one of the risks connected with archiving is the risk of fossilization, of petrification, we can say, of the archive. As a repository of the past, in a way, it is always, there is this risk of stagnation. Yes, stagnation always exists, especially if the archive is not being used. But even if archives are used, they are often perceived as places which where time has stopped. Reservoirs of history, we may say. And we know that Dorothy did not want it to be, and I quote here from Sandra's great presentation, dusty, dry archive. Yes, and I just wanted to ask you about this issue, about this problem and the future of the archive. I know that there is a group of people who is planning a future strategy for the archive. Could you comment on it? And can you tell us also how the materials from the archive will be used during the conference, which started today?
Okay, yes, we do want to use the archive and see it as a contribution to Dorothy's living legacy. She was, I know that Sandra can tell us that originally when it went to Manchester University, Metropolitan University, she was pleased that it was going to what was at that time a teacher training college, because she wanted it to be a resource that would be used by teachers, by practitioners, not simply by academics, that it would be a living resource and would get over that fossilization issue that you talked about, the dry, dusty archive. But there are issues at the moment in terms of, we know that there are 88 boxes of materials, and I think only 25 of those were catalogued by Sandra, because Dorothy continued to add to it over the years. So when Claire and I were in the archive, we were opening up boxes which said unsorted, and it was quite exciting to be looking through these unsorted materials. And so there is a need to catalogue it all. And even now we have people contacting us saying, we've got materials that should go in the archive. People have their own personal archives and collections. Even today, Cecily O'Neill gave me some materials, some letters and some documents. And so it could grow as a resource. And there's an urgent need, not only that it should be catalogued, all of it, but that it needs to be preserved and it needs to be digitized. So yes, we have a working group looking at the future of the archive, and we do see it as a necessity that it now should be moved to a library, an archive, to be under the supervision of a professional archivist and properly preserved, but also digitized so that it is available widely to the world. As Sandra said, John Carroll wanted to be able to touch the button on his phone or computer and get these materials. And that's one way we see of making sure that it is being used. It is continuing to inform the work of teachers and practitioners all over the world. And we also see it as an important thing to try and link up different archives, because there's archives and pockets of materials of Dorothy in libraries and other places around the world. So yes, the conference, the working groups, the archive working groups that I mentioned earlier, we will have these sessions dedicated to looking at materials from the archive, looking at what Dorothy was doing with these materials, maps, letters, objects, and so on, and thinking about how they can be used by teachers in the classroom today, either using the same material or looking at the strategies and thinking how they can use similar strategies in their own work. And that to me is part of making this archive a living legacy, exactly as Dorothy wanted, that it's being used, it's being drawn on, And again, I said earlier, I think we can learn from these resources perhaps even more than from a textbook, because we're engaging with those resources where they are open to us to interpret and to make sense of and to use for ourselves. And I think that is what Dorothy wanted. That's what Dorothy was about. So we want ultimately to form an international committee to support the archive. What at the moment, our working group is looking at finding a base, a new base, a library for the archive. And our working group consists of Tony Jackson, Sandra, and Stig Eriksson, and Rebecca Patterson from Manchester Metropolitan University, and John Rayner, who was teaching at MMU until his retirement a few years ago and was looking after the archive. So I hope that in the future, the archive may be a focus for events like this one. You know, I'd love to see this as an annual event where we're working around materials in the archive and even publications, perhaps. I was just talking to Steve, and we have a possible idea to produce a volume of Dorothy's letters. But we know that the priority must be cataloguing, preserving, and digitalizing those resources. And that in itself, another thing I realized on my visit was that in itself is a huge undertaking. So that's the situation at the moment.
Thank you for that, David. Tony, the next question is to you. You researched the archives of drama educators and theatre education companies, and you co-created Peter Slade archive. Could you tell us about your experience with archiving, and especially about the decision-making process concerned with the choice of material which should go into the archive, which should be saved, so to say. Perhaps you could comment also on the characteristics and specificity of theatre in education archives.
Right. Okay. Thank you, Agata, and hello, everybody. I'm coming at this sideways, so I'm not going to be talking specifically about Dorothy's archive. I suppose my interest in archives in the field of drama and education, theatre and education, applied theatre, was sparked by two separate events. One was an approach by Peter Slade out of the blue in the mid-1980s, inquiring whether the university would be interested in taking his huge collection of materials, which reached right back to his early work in the 1930s. And of course, I jumped at the chance. And it wasn't too long before we had his collection at the John Rylands Library in Manchester, and it has been, of course, fully catalogued and accessible. The other thing which sparked my interest or concern was in the 1990s, the gathering crisis in theatre and education. And as many of you will know, funding for work in arts work in schools that came from outside the school going into schools began to be cut at a huge rate. Companies were increasingly forced to close or merge, and archives were getting lost. I found this suddenly really quite alarming. And perhaps understandably, a company that's under pressure, probably the last thing they're going to be worried about is the stacks of documents and papers and videos that they've got on their shelves. If they're going to have to move suddenly, what happens to that material? And some of it did indeed go to skips and was lost. So I suppose what I fairly quickly learned was that archives matter. If we're going to understand our history and our present, and they are so important. And a lot of them were disappearing before our eyes. And I suspect many still are. And they matter, as I think Sandra and David have both said, not just to academics and librarians, but to all of us in the here and now, and to future generations, practitioners, teachers, students, as well as researchers. Slade, Heathcote, Gavin Bolton were all sensible enough to keep hold of their personal archives, and they were able to pass them on. And thank God we had people like Sandra looking out for them just in time. But for many companies and practitioners, they were lost, or they were at risk of getting lost. And I think, thankfully, a number of universities and a number of committed individuals woke up to how much potential historic value there was in these, what one might call, emergent cultural practices. These seem to be emerging and therefore not important, not significant, but actually it's often the emergent work that you hardly notice or that you take for granted that actually becomes really significant only a few decades later. So thanks to some energetic activity on the part of individuals and institutions and some real collaborative spirit, a lot of the archives that were at risk have now been saved. At Manchester, we've got the archives not only of Peter Slade, but Stephen Joseph, Pit Prop Theatre, a really important theatre and education company, Tiebreak, and there are similar collections at many other universities. But it's an ongoing process. There is work being done now that is probably hardly recognised as being significant, but it is. And I think we all have a responsibility to be looking out for archives to not just preserve work, but to make sure that it's accessible as well. Agata, you asked about what kinds of choices you make about what to include in an archive. And I think, I mean, my response really is to say that it's whatever the donor, the individual or the company value and offer to the library or whoever is going to receive the work. I don't think it's for us in, say, 2021 to make a judgment about what people in the future are going to find valuable. I mean, obviously, if there are in the collection are books and articles that are widely available elsewhere, well, that's a lower priority. But anything that is directly relevant to the donor's practice, that give unique insights to their ways of working, as well as their achievements, I think is something that we have to value and make sure is in the archive somewhere in some shape or form. It doesn't have to be in a dusty, dry library. There are all kinds of ways of preserving this material so long as they are accessible and well cared for. And I think I'll hold off on saying anything about theatre and education archives, Agata. I might say that a little bit more about that later on, because I know we're a little bit short of time.
Thank you very much. I wanted to actually refer also to an issue that is, I think, directly related to what you've just said, but also you've mentioned it in one of our conversations that we had before the conference. I wanted to ask you, do you think that we can talk about the political aspect of an archive and archiving? Do you see archiving as a potentially subversive process that can foster social change?
That's quite a question. I think my short answer is yes. I think there is a political value in keeping and valuing and providing ready access to work from the past, because these archives demonstrate that this broad area of work, covering, I mean, thinking of Peter Slade, covering a period of some 80 years, constitutes an important heritage. And I think the idea of heritage and legacy is really important here. DIE, TIE, Applied Theatre have a rich past. I mean, there have been, as we know, many achievements, really influential methodologies that are still with us, directly or indirectly. Much of which has been forgotten or parked. But I think above all, they can help us make the argument for resourcing the work in the present. And this is where perhaps the political dimension comes in. When politicians or others dismiss the work as trendy or of little more than passing interest, the facts will belie that. And a lot of those facts will lie in the archives. So we mustn't just park our past, we must learn from it. And I think it's not just about the achievements. I think one of the things that I found delving into the archive of Peter Slade, and perhaps even more so, the archives of theatre and education companies, is that they record the struggles that those companies had to get their work recognised and accepted. And I think those struggles and the record of those struggles can actually inspire us when we face similar struggles in the present. And I think those struggles are at least as intense now as they ever have been.
Yes, thank you for that. I think this is a very important issue, that to find our worries, our struggles, the questions we ask today, inscribed, so to say, in the long history of other struggles, is a very powerful thing politically and historically. I'm sure that we could all talk about it for a long time, but unfortunately and fortunately, we have to move on, and there is this last thing before we have, I think, 15 minutes for questions that I want to bring in. I asked the panelists to think about an object from an archive they have visited or created, which is especially important to them. Could you tell us what objects came to your mind? Maybe we can start with Sandra.
Right, thank you for that. It's an image. Image 1, print of Quo Vadis. It doesn't appear, you will have to imagine it. In 1993, Dorothy and her husband, Raymond, gave me this as a gift for creating her archive, there it is, and organising her conference at Lancaster University. I'll just let you look at it for a moment. Image 2, back of print. It's a limited edition signed by photographer Frank Sutcliffe. The location, probably the Yorkshire Moors, circa 1895, and back to image 1. The unreadable signs encourage symbolic interpretation. A metaphor for life? Does that sound a little bit familiar? For me, Quo Vadis encapsulates Dorothy, the archive, and me. Does the learning journey raise questions for this conference today? What kind of map will we need? How many signs and symbols will we read along the way? What shifts from clock to sacred time will we make? What roles and rituals will we encounter? What stories, myths, and legends will we hear and retell? tell? What obstacles will bar our path? What problems will need solving? Quo vadis, is it dawn or dusk? Are we at a crossroads for drama in education? Is one signposting a moral dilemma, man in a mess? And what about the other? I think that's for this conference to decipher. Image 3. And this is Dorothy's note to me on a piece of protective cardboard. Don't bend it, D. One level, a simple instruction, but knowing Dorothy, who knows?
Thank you. I think that can be an instruction for all of us. It can work in so many ways. Thank you for that. David, could you share your object or thoughts on the object, the object?
Well, we saw a clip of it earlier in the film, so I don't think we'll I had another film, but I don't think we'll need to share it because it's the Troilus Crusade scroll that you saw rolled out, which I have borrowed to share at the conference, the in-person event tomorrow. And there are 3, we found this in the archive, a roll of 3 huge scrolls, which has got carefully plotted the events of the story all the way along this scroll. And that scroll is something that it's a strategy that Dorothy used to have something long like that. I mean, this is huge, but it's a strategy she used to have something long like that, that all the group, all the children could get round and write and add on as they work, add different things to it. And I mean, that in itself could be months of work and a very valuable resource and inspiration to anybody teaching that or any other text, I think, in schools. So that's my choice.
Thank you. Tony?
Okay, mine is not from the Dorothy Heathcote Archive. It's a video, a rather poor quality video of a classic theatre and education programme created by Greenwich Young People's Theatre in 1987. And it's called School on the Green, and a programme that actually was a very exciting programme to experience. Very, very strongly influenced by Dorothy Heathcote's approaches. Now, the piece has been published, but there's something that you get from the video that you can't get from the script or from descriptions or articles about the program. It involves a complex process of actor teachers enroll short scenes which explore aspects of a fascinating story about a school or some teachers who were pioneering with new educational techniques in 1914. Short scenes followed by the school pupils being invited to interrogate those scenes, sometimes interrogate the actors, sometimes reflect on what they thought was going on and to come up with questions about what they were discovering. And I think what you get from the video, which you can't get in any other way, is the way in which some very skilled actor teachers moved from really convincing performance within a short 5-minute space to becoming workshop leaders or to responding to kids' questions in role. No matter how much you try to describe it, if you haven't got a model of seeing how that can work and what kind of interaction it generates with the kids, I think you lose something. So it's poor quality, but and there aren't many of these copies left. But I'm glad to say that I've sent all my copies over to De Montfort University, and I think they've managed to get a grant for digitizing these classic, old, poor quality, but nonetheless really valuable videos from what seems like another age.
Thank you, Tony. And I just thought when you were talking about the film, it made me think of perhaps the importance of the fact that we close this panel before we move on to questions, of course, with a film, because well, if we think about it, that a film is a procession of still frames, it somehow, you know, captures for me this dual character of an archive, that it captures and preserves, but also brings to life at the same time, and moves us closer perhaps to the position of witnesses of the past. And I would like to thank you all very much for your comments. You are an inspirational team indeed. Tomasz, could you tell us what questions we have in the chat window? I think we have about 10 minutes for questions, 12 minutes.
Fact, we've got one question, one comment / one question from Veronica Baxter. If you don't mind, I'll read both of them because, you know, the comment and the question are closely connected. Without wanting to be rude or ageist, I think that part of the problem is the demographic in this room. We are mostly post-50s, men retired from formal education or, like myself, pretty soon. How do we archive in an accessible way and build a living legacy through the people we teach now?
Can I respond to that? Shall I dive in?
Yep, go for it.
So for me, yes, it's got to be this living legacy, and this conference this weekend is part of that, because I've told the facilitators of the working groups that they should produce something that's like a teacher's pack as a guide to these materials and this project that Dorothy was doing, and that will then be published on the website. So you will have Dorothy's materials, but you will also have notes from teachers, interpretations. They will create still images, which will be photographed. They'll create pieces of film. This will all be put on one page on the mantlenetwork.com website for teachers to look at. So if they're interested in a project about Bronze Age people, they can look at that, and it will not do what Dorothy wouldn't have wanted, which is kind of give them lots of lesson plans that they follow exactly, but hopefully it will give them inspiration, ideas, things that they can use themselves. So I think it's partly a matter of presenting the materials in the archive in that way. So it's not simply, oh, I can see in the catalogue that there's something about whatever it might be, and then you look at the resource. It's digitized, and it's also presented in a way that is accessible and lively and informs people's work. And I'm also very pleased that at this conference we've got, yes, we've got some people with the demographic that you're suggesting, Veronica, but we also have 35 students who are going to be taking part. And I think it's important to inspire the new generation. And I have to say that here at Newman University, there are modules dedicated to Dorothy's work. And I think that sort of thing is great.
Could I add to that? My vision for the archive was that it would be using, and I know nothing about this, so I can have these dreams, enabling technology so that a user would be able to press a button and get a snippet or a fragment of Dorothy on a video, piece of Dorothy in a video, a piece of Dorothy on an audio tape, and choose which button to respond to, which role, that they could actually create a role. So it would be an interactive process with technology. That was my dream. How to do it, that's up to you, the next generation.
Can I just really endorse what Sandra and David have said? And I think digitization is one very exciting way forward. And there are quite a few applied theatre courses in drama departments, as well as courses in educational theatre at various places, where active work is undertaken that looks back and finds ways of using the past in the present. And I remember when I was teaching many years ago, we did look at classic models of theatre and education, and then find ways of making them work for the here and now. And it was one of the most exciting things was having 18, 19, 20-year-old students getting in touch with that material and finding their own way through it and adapting it, and some things they would say, no, you can't, you could not do this now, but we can use the principles on which that was based to create our own new work. But just the final thing, that perhaps the obvious thing is, digitization will bring a lot of these archives into the forefront and make it usable as practice, but we mustn't also undervalue the importance of the originals themselves and making sure that those are really carefully curated, because those are the sources from which we can digitize and make work more widely accessible. So I think it's a kind of two-pronged approach we've got to take.
Can I also comment very shortly? Is that okay? Do we have time?
Of course.
I think that's a very important question. So thank you for that question. And just to add something to the discussion, I think that also involving young people, so what you've all said, yes, people of different ages, yes, in the archiving process. I know that there was a student, yes, from Manchester City University, am I correct, also working or cooperating with you, yes, on the archive. A person very much interested in the archive and the archiving process. And I think that actually, in a way, ageism is also a problem, because I think that today we live in a very divided world, and people from young people or young people do not spend enough time perhaps with people who can tell them about the past, and vice versa. I think that there is also a problem, a broader problem there, perhaps, that can be thought about. And yes, what Tani said seems very important, that digitalization always, and yes, and this is necessary, but we always have to remember about the original, about the objects themselves, the artifacts themselves. And it's, I think it's great to see, for example, for me, because I teach students who are 20 something, how many people are actually interested in the idea of the archive and in those original objects that can be encountered and viewed, mostly as digitized or in the kind of transmedial form, but also that the idea that they do exist as originals is actually quite exciting for many of my students, anyway, the students I teach. So thank you. Are there any other questions or comments? Tomasz, do you want to read anything else?
I'm afraid there are no more questions in the chat.
Oh.
Well, new comment.
Okay.
I'll read the comment from Peter Wayne Wilson. We absolutely look at all of that classic Thai work with students still, and are still teaching the principles on which they were built, with the constant question of how this relates to here and now. The dearth of accessible video and online media are a real frustration with this, and the news about the saving of video content is very welcome. Yeah, I guess we can agree.
Thank you very much. And are there any last comments from?
I was just going to say, Peter formed Big Brum Theatre in Education. I don't know if Peter, if there's an archive for Big Brum, because it's done some amazing work over the years, and we should. I'm not going to take on the archiving of that as well, but somebody should be archiving that, Peter.
think we have 3 minutes. So if there are any other questions, one question, we still have time for one question. And if not, then maybe we could finish with some last comments from our panelists.
Well, I just want to say one thing that I forgot to say, and it's a kind of wish for the conference from Dorothy. That Quo Vadis reminded me of the closing moment of the 1993 conference when Dorothy posed that very question to the delegates. So I'm going to pose it. Quo Vadis, whither goest thou? And she hoped that the archive would inspire the delegates to plant the seeds of her methodology around the world. That's what I would like this conference to do.
Thank you very much, Sandra.
I think we should make that the final word, actually.
Yes,
Tony,
yes, I think
some
so.
final thought or not?
Well, I was just going to add that some years ago I started an occasional series called Mapping the Archives for the RIDE journal, Research in Drama Education. And we ran it from about 2012 to 2018, I think, and then I stopped doing it. But there's a lot of really useful information about drama and education archives, theatre and education archives, applied theatre archives around the world, with people like Veronica from Cape Town contributing, among many others. And it would be great if there was somebody else who was willing to take that project on, because I think it needs constant updating. The more we know about archives around the world covering this area, the better. And I think there is perhaps a little bit of a dearth at the moment of wider communication. I mean, that's one reason why I think this conference is great to have. But we need to make sure that everybody is aware not only of the value of archives, but the importance of letting other people know about the archives, where they are and how they can be accessed.
Well, I can see a comment from Veronica that I think is very pertinent in the chat. She says, I'm very excited to think of the possibilities of these archives mushrooming all over, making our work visible and fabulous.
Thank you very much. And I think that, yes, we have to finish. I would like to thank our panelists once again, Sandra, Tony, David, Tomasz, thank you for managing the chat. And I'd like to thank all of you for participating in this panel. I wish you a great 2 days of the conference, and thank you for giving me a chance to be a part of this meeting, to be a part of this panel today.
Thank you, Agata.